Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Chief Digital Manager of Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining this Dataversity webinar, The Value of Metadata, sponsored by MarkLogic. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we'll be collecting them via the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you'd like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using hashtag Dataversity. As always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recording of the session, and additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce to you our speaker for today, Matt Turner. Matt is the Chief Technology Officer of Media and Entertainment at MarkLogic, where he develops strategy and solutions for media, publishing, entertainment, and information provider markets, and works with customers and prospects to create leading-edge information and digital content application with MarkLogic's Enterprise NoSQL database. Matt has worked closely with MarkLogic customers, including NBC, Warner Brothers, LexisNexis, McGraw-Hill Finance, Dow Jones, and more. And with that, I will give the floor to Matt to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thanks everybody for joining. And hello from New York, where I'm based, to talk about the value of metadata. So as Shannon talked about with the Q&A, I'm completely welcome to you guys chiming in with questions. I also wanted to just say that I've got the chat window open as well. And so if I see something coming across, I'll also try to address it. And I may have a thing or two to ask you guys in the audience as we get started. So I like the way that Shannon and Dataversity run their webinars. Open up the line, sort of get started. And the first thing that I did a couple minutes ago was I put up this disclaimer. And this is how I'm actually going to start the presentation, which is by telling you all about the things I'm not going to do. So at no time will the speaker presenting this webinar seek to declaratively define the elusive and debatable term metadata. Attendees should be warned that this term will be used broadly. In deference to Mike Ellis, head of production of BBC, this presentation will attempt to not use the term technical metadata because, and I've had this conversation with him many times, isn't that just technical data? But really, members should consider themselves warned that this term metadata and other uses may be used in ways that you might find not only, I hope I did put the word unsuitable, but hopefully in a way that you will spur conversation. Now I put this up here because I wanted to have a little fun. And as people who know me will know, I will have my joke. But I also wanted to put it up here on behalf of the Metadata Presenter Disclaimer Committee because this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about metadata, and really, really importantly, I'm going to be reflecting how other people see it, because I'm not somebody that, and I've been doing this work for a long, long time. Some of the very first systems I was working with were in the publishing world, gathering up metadata. And I know that there really isn't a single way to describe it. So I wanted to open up with that broad idea, a little bit of reflection on the fact that this is an interesting topic. And I wanted to invite my first little bit of audience participation, if I can. I know there's some folks dealing with audio stuff, but those of you who can hear me, I would like to ask the question of who this is. So who knows what the picture on the screen represents? Who is this person and what is this person doing? I can just take a second and see if somebody can, yes, okay, there we go, right away, yes, okay. Yes, the nerd force is strong in this audience. You guys nailed it. Chevy Chase as president. So this is Chevy Chase as President Ford. Now, we're going to be talking about metadata. I thought I would begin with a simple idea, or probably easiest to understand. It's not Will Ferrell, it's Chevy Chase. That metadata around assets is a really good use case. It's something that I've been involved with. And I wanted to begin with this picture because I really, really like this sketch where Chevy Chase didn't really bother to imitate or impersonate. It's listed as an impersonation. But really, he just kind of acted himself. He didn't bother to try to talk like Gerald Ford, didn't bother to even try to look like him. But everything around you, the phones, the flag, and of course the way he acted, which is sort of falling off the stage in this hysterical sketch, immediately let you know that he was impersonating Gerald Ford. And it's those clues from the experience of watching this video that provide the context and to me are a really, really good way to think about why metadata is important and also how complex it is, because it's the context of the data around something like this clip. It's the context around the way it was made, and all these little clues are there. There's systems that generate a lot of data now in the way things are made. It's the way it was produced, the way they actually made the images come together, the way it was finally mixed, and of course the way it was annotated and descriptive. So that's a picture. It's a little joke I have, which is a picture of an author creating metadata. And if you're in that part of the business, you know that that doesn't exist. That's actually George Plimpton writing a book, probably ignoring all the pleas for metadata. Of course, metadata follows you out at GPU distribution, and the way we consume things today, it's full of metadata. And now we've got all this information around our original asset, but only if we actually look across all this information can we understand what it really is in that asset. So the little clues that we get watching it, hey, that's Gerald Ford, what a great clip, that's all just one part of the puzzle. And that same complexity applies in this very classic case, metadata around an asset. It's now applying to every type of data that we touch. Every bit of information that flows through our organizations needs to be findable, discoverable. You need to be able to think about the governance and the associated mechanisms that have been applied to that data so you can use it. It's also there in the real world, and the idea that all of the products and all of the tangible goods that we help produce and provide data with, that's also full of metadata. And then, of course, our actual customers. Who are we actually working with? Who are we actually dealing with? And I'm making some big generalizations because everybody in the industry, on the call is from different industries, but ultimately, we're really concerned with doing something in our organizations that impact other people, and there's tons of data about people. And this is kind of the scope that I like to look at with that metadata, which is a really big scope. And luckily, I'm not alone. So the Dataversity team put together this report called the Emerging Trends in Metadata Management. It was published last year, and it's frankly been a godsend putting this together, so thank you, Dataversity team. But it also was a really good read for me because they, like me, did not attempt to say, we're going to say metadata is this one thing. Instead, they asked people. And they got some really great comments. So I've excerpted a couple of them. And of course, Shannon mentioned we'll deliver you guys out some materials so you get a pointer to this. But anything that describes or helps understand the data object itself. I think that's really getting to the action behind it, describing all the information about the data. So I admitted the most obvious one, data about data. But then, the business definitions, the business rules. Third one starts to get really into it. Okay, now we're going to include everything that is in the entire scope. Security, the source of the record, the life cycle, lineage. And then finally, I like that last one because it comes back to where we started with Chevy, the context within which a given piece of data exists. Where it came from, where is it headed, what's it used for, why is it used this way. So it's really powerful stuff. And it was great to go back into the subject. Like I said, I've off and on worked pretty closely in the space around lots of different kinds of metadata projects. And it's great to go back into it because now when I look at this and I start to take those comments, and then now we're doing a lot of work with enterprise data projects, thinking about governance, thinking about the usability of data. Sorry, I'm going to go back to the report just for a second to say that it's one of the things the report highlights is the growing importance of being able to use data itself and how metadata makes that possible. You can't know what you don't know without all of this data that surrounds your information. And when I look at that and really think about the value of metadata, you can kind of think about it as all these different operations that people need to do critical to their organizations focused on data, just simply managing the data, but then governing it, make sure all of the provenance, lineage, survivorship issues that you have when you're bringing data together, operating your business based on data and analyzing things, discovering the information, knowing where it's about, and of course going to archive. And you can see that the data, the metadata of all types, is critically important across all of it. And I think it's really important to have this kind of breadth of conversation. And for me, that was a very interesting way to do is look across all of these different processes, think about this common data, and then we can take a step back and say, look, it's really key to leveraging data. It's simply the most important piece of information may not be the actual asset itself sitting on a disk somewhere, but it may be all those connections, all those pointers that are many, many different places, and that's kind of also the point of this chart. But without all those collections, without all those pointers, you can't get to that information that's key. Now, does that make it the most important type of data? Well, I've got a whole bunch of people here who have joined to talk about metadata, so certainly it makes it a very popular topic and a very important topic. And that's what, again, coming back to the emerging trends and metadata that the Dataversity team was pointing out. So 2/3 of the respondents of the survey. It's a great survey. As you guys know, because you're involved with the Dataversity event, the breadth of industry, the types of organizations, everything from huge multinationals to smaller, medium shops. So a lot of breadth in the respondents and a lot of unified clarity around the fact that metadata is now more important than it was 10 years ago. But then there's some interesting things that we looked at in the data. Only about 30%, not only, shockingly, 30% of people weren't doing anything with metadata or had been doing it for less than a year. I kind of added those up. There's a 20-something of people who weren't doing anything at all. So that's interesting to report that out. It's very, very important, but not everybody's on board. And then, and this is kind of more telling, about 1/4 of respondents listed out core metadata, things like relational data that's operating their business, data warehouse information, business glossaries. They listed out the fact that about 25% responded in one way or another, so it's not an exact count there, that they were unable to manage that critical metadata. And this matches what I've experienced over the years working in this area. Metadata is very, very important. Metadata is very, very difficult. And that's kind of where I want to jump into the meat of what's really going on. What's really going on with metadata today is that we have this big understanding, this big drive, this big need. Every possible buzzword that we've gone through, from big data, I'm now getting involved with things around Industry 4.0. It's all about driving data, data-driven. It's foundation for all the artificial intelligence and machine learning technology that we're pursuing to make our lives easier and to get better answers. Data is the foundation of all of it. Metadata is how you find it. It's still very difficult. And this is why, because while across all of these different stages, we can understand the value of metadata and we can pinpoint some big categories of things that I'm calling metadata. Again, in deference to Michael Isles, I will just say that's technical data. But the point is that there's a lot of different types of information. It turns out that in every one of these cases, metadata tends to end up in silos. When you're managing information, you get it done. You have your own way of doing MDM. You have your own set of governance just to bring it together. There's actually sometimes a governance layer that's separate from that. The operational teams look at it differently. The analytics teams go back and mine all that information separately and bring it into their sphere of influence. Same thing happens when you want to discover it. You might have to redo some of that basic governance so that people get the latest and greatest for that purpose. And of course, archiving happens at the end of life and sometimes has to redo it all. So every one of these types of functions is touching and creating and generating this data, but it's done with very business-specific systems. And the result is that you've got metadata, but you've got it all over your organization. In fact, one of the quotes from the report, Emerging Trends in Metadata Management, just said, it said, metadata is everywhere. And I think that's really very accurate. It's everywhere, highly valued, and to a large degree unharnessed. And how is this possible? How did we decide metadata was the most important thing? Put in these great structures. I mean, again, go back to some of those quotes in the report talking about the importance of metadata across every critical function of a modern business that's going to rely on data. How do we end up with it being all over the place and sort of loosely managed? Well, I have a saying, and I've said this often enough, people who know me might have heard it before, that metadata is sneaky. It is the kind of data that appears to be easy to manage, but very quickly breaks the bounds and starts to go around all the things you do to govern it and bring it together, and frankly, ends up often enough with this kind of picture. So how is it sneaky? Well, It's sneaky because it looks like it should fit in rows and columns of a traditional database system. It's got dates, titles, things you can name. You know, here I'm going down the line of thinking about the rich media assets. So titles, production dates, categories, assets. Like you can start to list off columns, and you can pretty easily see in your head rows that are filling it up. But there are a couple of really big problems when you get into any moderate amount of complexity with metadata. The first thing here is that you have to define everything up front. So you have to be thinking, what is my purpose? And so this approach, by its very nature, aligns it to only one business purpose. And that's a big part of the responsibility of that picture before about everything in silos. Silos are simple, silos are the easiest ways to get the job done. It's something that's really, really necessary if you're going to model metadata in rows and columns. But before you even get to that, you'll probably run into complexity. How many of each entity? So this is a rich media asset. Seems simple, right? Chevy Chase on the phone, he's impersonating Gerald Ford. Oh, do I need to have a character table and an actor table? Okay, I got that. Let me keep going. How did it come? Oh, Lorne Michael, he's the producer, but he wasn't the executive producer on that at the time, so I need a producer's table, but then I need a people table, and pretty soon I'm either making decisions to add columns or I'm populating tons of relational tables with entities that may or may not be germane to every single kind of object. If I've got this particular clip, and then I've got a bunch of educational clips, and I've got a bunch of other kinds of rich media clips, maybe they don't need all that fullness of the commercial media landscape in the metadata. Maybe they don't need 100 tables, but they may need 100 different tables. So what deserves a separate table? What deserves a column length? And as you start to go out and out, and particularly when you start to take some of the clues that let us know this is Gerald Ford, like there are telephones on the table, or you know, he mistook a glass for a phone. By the way, if people haven't seen this clip, just don't do it now, but just remember to go watch it. It's brilliant. Anyways, people are starting to collect that kind of metadata, and do we add a column for that? Prop, gag, right? We just keep going, and it's going to be very, very difficult to make tables that manage this. So there's some real problems here, and hopefully I'm preaching to the choir in a good way. And sort of sympathizing, because I wrote metadata systems based on relational tables, and it was always difficult. You often had to put placeholders in. Who hasn't seen a schema that has something that says something like author 1, or author, and then author 1, and then author 2? Turns out you might have more than one in the same role, but they don't merit a separate table just now, because you're kind of too far down the line. And then when you do have to make a real change, you have to redo the whole thing. The schema has to be redone, has to be rethought to accommodate that kind of major refactoring from something as simple as a new asset coming in that has information that really just can't be put into another column. Okay, so part of metadata being sneaky is that it leads you down this path thinking, you can go in rows and columns, but starts to really, really burden you with the burden of modeling things in a relational rows and columns way. Another big sneaky part of metadata is your taxonomies, your lookups, the things you relate to that describe the data. So I've talked about rows and columns in terms of, tables in terms of things, people, places, major objects in your schema. Now we're going to talk about reference data, taxonomies, lookup tables, many, many different words for them across many, many different ways of modeling data. But for the most part, in a traditional system, these are hierarchical, fixed taxonomies. I have a top-line category, it's got subcategories, it's got subcategories, and it's got subcategories. The kind of thing you can put into an Excel spreadsheet to manage, which, as many of us know, is actually the way a lot of this stuff is managed. And again, you really can start going down this line of diverting rapidly from the reality of what you're trying to describe and the way it can be implemented with this model. In this one, I've got a little entertainment taxonomy, and you can see pretty quickly that I've got a problem because when I make, no matter how I do it, if I redid it different ways, I would always end up with this duplication later on, where, here I'm looking at major feature films and then TV series, and then I've got action and drama, and those are the same categories for each, but I really needed to differentiate between cable and broadcast, so I had to put those repeating leaf nodes of the taxonomy into my taxonomy. And that's very, very common because you do need all that richness. You need to understand the whole breadth of the hierarchy in order to assign some real value in order to use it later. So first of all, you have to make all those decisions as you're creating the taxonomy. Second of all, you're making those decisions, again, specific to a business purpose. And then what happens when that's not enough? Do you do nested taxonomies and somehow in a very quasi-lookup relational way? Do you have multiple taxonomy fields, taxonomy 1, taxonomy 2, taxonomy 3? Is it flat? In a lot of parts of the industry we work with, where people are forced into tools that only support this, they've actually given up on the hierarchy. It's really interesting to see that it turns out keywords, free-form tags are, because they need the flexibility, people have actually shied away from this way. So again, another place where metadata is very sneaky is in the way you describe it with a traditional approach, hierarchical taxonomy. So these two things together are kind of the 1-2 punch that leads a lot of systems to be very functional with metadata, but these systems themselves stand by themselves as being supporting a very, very specific purpose. You can make this work if you're going to be building a discovery system. If you're taking your metadata and you're marshaling it and you're looking across all the governance activities in your business. But that same data, because of these decisions you're making, how it's stored, cannot just be simply lifted and put into the archive system and made useful. So this is often the result, that you have the difficulties in the model of putting this very complex set of data, which is, again, all the data that describes the assets. So in other words, it's a model of the world in some cases, into this rigid format, ends up with hundreds of metadata fields, sorry, that really should even say tables, hundreds of metadata fields across hundreds of metadata tables, and then that may not even get into some of the more complex things like provenance governance, survivorship, those kinds of data that have a whole other set of complexity to them. So at the end of the day, you get this kind of inflexible, incomplete data model, and it doesn't really describe the richness of even an asset like this, but not to mention something even more critical like a financial data system that's going to be aligned to another financial data system and another financial data system in your organization. So this is why I think metadata is sneaky, because it looks like it can fit, but when you try it out, you end up hitting all of these barriers. And there's an assumption here that I'm making that I want to point out, that it's necessary to know what your metadata is, but it's really not possible to describe it perfectly up front. You know, the enemy of the perfect. Good is the enemy. Good is good enough, and I'm forgetting the rest of the term, the enemy of the perfect. But that's often the case with metadata. If you take this approach and you stop everything you're doing to define those data models that everybody will use across your organization, you're going to find that the organization has moved on beyond you, and that definition took so long and is so complex that it will never actually be able to describe it. So defining everything up front is what you need to do with this model, and it really can't be done, and even when you do, it's aligned to a specific business purpose. So the result is that you get something like this. 100 tables, hundreds of items of metadata. This is actually just the person part of a master metadata schema. I could have made this much smaller and put 10 times many more, and none of you probably would be surprised if that was a real metadata system. I mentioned that I came from this background. I used to work at Sony Music. We had the title metadata system, and thank you, Dan. Perfection's the enemy of progress. We had the title mastering system, and it was a database that had at least 200 tables. Now, that may, again, look like a nice, easy way to do things. How much complexity can there be in musical recording? Well, unless you've tried modeling classical music, you haven't really delved into the complexity of metadata. So you get these very, very complex data sets, and first of all, you get complexity. It takes time to create them, takes time to model them, takes a lot of effort to maintain them. Second of all, you get inflexibility. And this is really the key. Inflexibility is something that, well, I guess you can turn it the other way. Agility is very, very important in a data-driven digital transformation business. and I didn't go into a lot of why digital transformation is at the heart of this, but data-driven digital transformation is largely on the topic when people start about, data transformation is largely on the topic when people start to talk about using data. You have to be agile. This locks you in to specific purposes. So there you've got your silos, but more than that, if you're looking across all your data, it makes your data, or now your metadata, the most important asset you have, inflexible. Inflexibility means you have to break it all apart and rebuild it whenever things need to be changed. And the last thing is lost time. By the time you get the model going, by the time you have enough of it together to actually load data to see if it's right, it could be months, and things could have changed, forcing you to rethink it or constantly be behind. So this is why a lot of metadata projects that look at that scope we looked at across every single kind of data and process involving data, but a lot of projects don't make it past very much of the starting line, fail when they go further, or end up with a metadata governance or a set of data aside from the core data that isn't operational and sort of off to the side. And one way to wrap all this kind of up is that when you're using this traditional database tools, it's kind of like you're working in concrete. So concrete is a wonderful medium. You can build amazing, fantastic things, including an armadillo. But there's something that concrete, there's one attribute of concrete that is really, really fatal to metadata projects, and that's when something changes, out comes the dynamite. You need to rebuild it all. It's not possible to adopt and suddenly make your concrete benches into patio furniture and then have them change into something that's mobile. That's not happening. You have to rebuild it. So I think I've teed you guys up enough. I'm just going to take a quick check, see if there are any comments in the chat. Oh, lots of people are telling me the things I missed. Enemy, yes, thank you. It is Voltaire. The best is the enemy of the good. That's exactly what I was looking for. Any other comments, questions? How well do you think the modeling, development, change management tools encourage metadata during tasks each day? That is a great question about metadata curation. And I'm actually not even getting into that. I'm really getting into the fact that even if you had tools that allowed people to create metadata on the fly, unless you have a different approach than the relational, it still won't end up with the really, truly universal view. Okay, I'm going to go back to my talk track. Thanks, guys, for chiming in. And we're going to take this idea of metadata rigidly put into rows and columns, and we're going to look for a new approach. So this came about, I'm just going to give you guys an aside in this slide. This came about with my colleague Alicia, who's on, because people talk about metadata as the data that's all around us and surrounds us, and they start to sound like Obi-Wan Kenobi. So with a nod to Obi-Wan Kenobi, we're going to a new approach. And I didn't go so far as to say it's a new hope, but just because actually this is working. So the first part of a new approach to metadata is to think about getting schema flexibility. Instead of rows and columns, think about taking something from the NoSQL world and talking about documents and trees. What if you didn't need to define everything up front? What if a tree structure? And this is something that I can trace back to some of the very early work I did when I was first. So I mentioned Sony Music. I was also at PC World, building some of the first online publishing systems, managing metadata. We very quickly started modeling things in XML. We forced them and stored them in relational databases, but our actual model was a tree because of the very, very simple problem of the author problem. How many authors are there associated to an asset, a piece of content? It's not good to have author 1, 2, and 3. Do I really need to know? In a tree structure, you just have author. And if there's more than one, it's no big deal. So what if you didn't need to define everything up front? As the exact answer for metadata is in a tree structure, you don't. And what if a lot of those other nasty modeling issues, it turns out they're just as simple as adding new elements. Now, before we go way, way far and say, oh, anybody can have any element, this doesn't mean that there's not a schema. It means that the method of doing the data modeling based on tree structures. You can talk about it as JSON, you can talk about it as XML, you can talk about it as an entity model. But when you actually go down that route of modeling the core data for metadata, or the core structure for metadata, you actually don't have to define everything up front, and you can solve things like those difficult decisions about is it another table or is it another column. It's not. It's another entity. It belongs in a place in the data model, and you can add it. Now, I'm going to go back to the picture of Chevy there. As you'll hear, we do a lot of metadata work in the intelligence agencies. And in fact, I was canvassing my colleagues ahead of doing this talk, just to give them, hey, what's the latest? And the only thing, I got one-liner back from my Intel colleague. Don't forget the sparse data problem. Right from the start, some of our most impactful work was, and was very eye-opening to me, was the collection of sparse data in intelligence systems. So I'm going to use Chevy as an example. If we truly did want to annotate this particular asset with the fact that there were phones on the desk, and it was a glass as a prop, and he had the American flag next to him, and the color of his suit, taupe? Let's go for taupe. And lovely brown tie. If you want to annotate all of that, you could. With this model, it's perfectly fine to add those entities and those values on and on and on. Now, the reason I mentioned intelligence agencies is this is actually a very, very big deal, because thousands and thousands of columns of metadata can be collected on things like in their world are called assets, and they must be collected, they must be curated, but it can break the relational models to have 10,000 columns where only one or two items of data in a million rows are actually present. In this world, it's no big deal. If you don't annotate every clip with that rich detail, it doesn't matter, but the ones that have it, prop, and I guess those are mostly props, prop and wardrobe, they're there. So this is the first big leap. It's thinking about tree structures, using the lessons from NoSQL to model metadata. So what if you can keep everything? And mostly I've been talking about values. But now I want you guys to think about things like provenance. Think about the issues around data governance that have very, very complex data strings to them that now could be described at the core with tree structured data attached to the assets themselves, or, as we'll make a big leap, perhaps in relationships. So that's the first one, is thinking about schema flexibility with NoSQL. The second one is to introduce semantics. So I'm going to give a brief segue into semantic data. If you are an expert in semantic data, then you will say, aha, I know this. But every time I do this, I always learn something, even myself. So semantic data is the information, it's a simple type of information, subject, predicate, object, and these small pieces of data put together in millions are what are powering a lot of the contextual semantic web, as Tim Berners-Lee envisioned it, but also the contextual delivery of information, and it's the building blocks for a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about machine learning and neural networks. So semantic data is absolutely a thing. It's been around for a while. It hasn't been around in operational data systems, though, until the last 4 or 5 years. So the concept was originated in the, I think the Tim Berners-Lee paper was actually 2000, and I like to describe it as people who really, really got semantics kind of went off in one direction, and then people who kind of were working on the document data-based web kept sort of plodding along, and then about 4 or 5 years ago, everybody crashed back together. People started to realize that when they were modeling this kind of critical data, it wasn't enough to keep cramming into rows and columns, or even what I just talked about with documents. Sometimes you do need to actually express relationships. You need to express entities that have relationships between them, and you need to express models of things that are much bigger than a simple document. And that's where semantic data comes in. So triples describe single facts. The data structure at its root is called a triple, those 3 pieces of data. I've got one out there, so actually there's a bunch of triples. Chevy lives in New York. New York's in the USA. Now you can infer that Chevy lives in the USA. Those collections of facts allow you to model with data real-world scenarios. How do we take this to metadata? Well, we're going to use ontologies instead of categories. Instead of hierarchical categories, We're going to create models of things. So again, I'm going back to the world of media and talking about characters in film series and actors and how they all can relate to each other, and in fact, how they do relate to each other in the real world. That ontology, which is the rules of how they fit together, and then that semantic data, which is a specific one that might relate to this clip, that data is separate from the actual asset. Another way of thinking about this is it greatly simplifies metadata. Instead of packing in hierarchical taxonomy entities into my metadata record, instead of packing in every possible association that's related, I do want to come back to media because it's great. One thing I love about living in New York City is people understand properly how to go see films. When you see a film in New York City, everybody sits in the audience and the credits roll and you actually hang out and watch the credits. It's kind of you know you're in the right crowd, you know you're seeing a new film or there's some interest when you've got that kind of interest. I always say, look at us, we're sitting here watching metadata. So if you've seen a film and you've watched the credits, all of that data is actually the metadata associated to it. Now imagine if you put all that data into the metadata record itself. The grip, the key grip, the second production unit, as again, we'd be back to having all these tables. But if you actually use a semantic model, you can very accurately describe that metadata. In fact, you can use that same model because probably those people are involved in multiple productions, and now you have this new class of asset, which is ontologies to describe it and semantic data to flesh it out. It's not just for again, we're talking about values, but actually you can use this approach for all categories of information. Back in the media world, we do some work with folks at Disney, and they are doing a lot of work to model things like fictional worlds, how people relate to each other, characters and plots. Great stuff. More on the enterprise side of things, taking that same concept, this complex data, we're using it very actively to model and actually record things like governance, business glossaries, the data that actually flow and actually connect the information, the metadata that's sort of the connective tissue fits really, really well with this model. And that's what we kind of bring forward. We're looking at a different approach. Instead of rows and columns, using the document structures for the core asset metadata, and then ontologies to describe the relationships, ontologies to describe the rules, and semantic data to actually describe the relationships between those concepts and this asset, offloading a ton of complexity from the asset record itself into the semantic side of things, but of course using the asset record for things that make a lot of sense. Descriptions, things like dates where it can be very complex to model in the semantics, use them on the document side. And doing this in combination. Doing this in combination as the actual model behind the metadata. So we started off this whole conversation thinking about the value of metadata and the promise to be able to look across and see the complete picture of your data, the metadata, the complete picture of the data about your data. I'm going to get in trouble with Michael there. And then we came to this idea that there is a model that can really capture that. Now, I've given you guys a simple one. When we're getting into some of these systems, we're now talking about millions of triples on the semantic side. Tree structures with hundreds of data elements in them. But managed with a model, managed with real schemas, and put into action. And that's actually how we think we can accurately describe something like this clip from Chevy Chase. But also we can actually bring this into the other world of almost any world of metadata management. So I've been talking a lot about metadata. Hopefully you guys can see that I'm pretty passionate about it. I am talking on behalf of MarkLogic, and this is what we've been up to. We've been up to making a database that actually follows that data model, that is universally applicable, but is particularly good with metadata. Easy to get data into it. Again, you don't have to define everything up front, and particularly when you're dealing with complex metadata, that can be a godsend. Easy to get data out of it. So we haven't talked a lot about why that model makes things much more accessible, but it does make things much more accessible. And very, very germane to metadata, and we'll start talking about some use cases, is that it's also operationally focused on enterprise operations. Metadata, being as important as it is, the uses that we're seeing put together when you combine the findability of your assets, the governance of the data to make sure you've got the right information, and the potential for the data-driven business, it's very, very important that the system you're using is actually enterprise-grade, has things like transactions. So somebody was asking what asset is. That's the measure. That's a sorry. I'm actually not going to go into the whole separate thing. That's just a description of an isolated transaction that makes sure that what you put into the database comes back out of the database, and also has things like security, because when you now are getting into this world of managing your business data, not everybody can see everything, and that also has to be taken into account. So with that leaping off point and with that data model in mind, I'm just going to talk about a couple of cases where we've seen this data model and this particular approach tackling metadata. And the first is a system at a bank to manage asset inventory. So now we're going to switch from one kind of asset, which is something like a film or a clip, to technical assets. We're talking about servers and systems and the relationship and all the software and actually all the maintenance and all the work that's done on those systems. So taking a really, really deep dive down into a very difficult problem for any organization, the technical asset management, and coming back up using the model of structured documents to actually store the information and semantics to link it together. This system at TIE has actually brought together about 100 data sources. So you can see some of the things that are listed on the left, and they include not only the actual hardware descriptions, software that's running on them, the management of the software that's running on, the versions of the management of the software that's running on, the people that have access to them, the accounts, the security profile, and I can keep going. It's an amazing, amazing amount of data. It's an amazing amount of enterprise metadata, and it was really, really isolated and difficult to manage. Many, many systems providing one particular view of it until we're able to bring it together. And there's some good answers for why. First of all is that speed of the business needs answers, particularly now when you have this view of this data being vital for cybersecurity. The type of information was not all neatly structured. So to do any kind of analysis required people to pull data from one system, documents from another, understand them. And when we start to get to some of the things they were able to look at, being able to see these systems in relationship, they're able to actually look at software that's affected, which part of the business is using which part of the hardware, what kind of system has what kind of patch level, and for any kind of given issue, they can actually look across the organization and see the state of the state. So this is shifting from the one kind of assets to another, but really taking that model and putting it into a very, very enterprise business-focused example. And I talked a little bit about some of the results, but it's a very, very important system. It's a very new approach to deliver what's now considered to be an important system for an organization that values data above all, well, not above all, but equally, I think, above in terms of industries. Financial services looks at data as an asset. I'm going to switch from that one to talk a little bit about some intelligence use cases. I'm going to switch from that one to this example of a metadata catalog that we helped create for one of the U.S. combatant systems. And I'm going to talk a little generally because there are some other metadata catalogs out there. And these systems, unlike the technical asset management system, these systems actually, so those are about efficiency and visibility of data to help them run the business. These are mission-driven systems where, particularly after the events of 9/11, information sharing became paramount. But information sharing does not mean throwing away or having any less security and restrictions on which information you share. So there's been a very interesting thing happening over the past now 16 years in the intelligence agencies where collaborative efforts are very common, but they need to be done in the context of really stringent rules and sharing requirements. This is one such example. It's the Integrated Intelligence Surveillance Reconnaissance System. It's all about linking together multiple data points, some of them actually gathered in the field, and then inventorying them in a metadata catalog so that they can be used or seen or potentially shared between all the interested parties across, again, this is a U.S. Defense Department system across the U.S. forces. When you get into these systems, the complexity of the information is diverse. So there isn't really a nice way to model it. And again, that's going back to the why this new approach. But more than that, you really need to see this, how the information works together. They are literally doing things like capturing, well, let's just say, acquiring a very important piece of telecommunications information, material, and then registering that into the system, and then saying, okay, well, we've got this. So all of that data that they generate is very, very complex and different depending on the particular sphere they're working in, or depending on the particular asset they're talking about. But it all needs to be cataloged and shared. So at the end of the day, it goes into a very large, visible, across multiple departments system. And when we go back to that model where we have as a tree structure and the semantics, you can see that this model would be very, very helpful. The tree structure lets them accurately store multiple types of information. So something can be very simple, it's a recorded phone call. Something can be very, very complex. Here's a part for something that we just captured. And the semantic data helps link it all together. It's associated to this particular place, it's associated to this particular person. These systems are really another take at metadata that, again, I wasn't as aware of until I joined MarkLogic, but really struck home as being the kind of work that we've all been doing to make sure data gets into the right hands. Now, a lot of what I've said before is focused on the commercial sphere, but I think there are a lot of lessons to be taken from these kind of data sharing, intelligence data sharing metadata catalogs that have a lot more restrictions on them, but at the same time they have a wonderful breadth, or very big breadth of data. And what's really important at the end of the day is that they're delivering information to mission critical projects that are really out there protecting our lives. So hats off to the U.S. metadata catalogs, and also another example of using this. And there's some features that MarkLogic particularly is good at, which is making sure the information is brought out to all these different. So not only are we talking about modeling this very complex data, but we're actually talking about moving it between different systems so that it can be locally available. But at the end of the day, it's all about making this data that's raw into consumable information. And then I'm going to come back to Chevy Chase, because I put Chevy up there with a purpose. MarkLogic was fortunate enough to actually be involved in the development of the NBC Saturday Night Live back-end systems that include the app. And to this day, we were involved actually for the 40th anniversary, but it's up and running. To this day, that way of modeling data is actually what the SNL team did. There's very, very sparse data on the individual episodes. That really was sort of Chevy Chase was forward, and it was recorded at a certain date, and it's kind of all you had. And what the team at SNL was seeing was that there was a lot of viewing on the most current episodes online, even though the whole catalog was actually available on multiple platforms, and people weren't really mining the back catalog. But when they told people about it, everybody expressed the interest. And what they decided to do was to build that metadata, that rich metadata using ontologies and semantics that links that initial asset information to the way the fans, well, you and me, and the fans see the show. And one of the interesting things about that is that everybody has a different golden era. To be honest, if you're up late at night watching SNL, it probably was for only a certain slice of your life, even though you may stay current later. So a lot of people have the 90s in mind when they think about it. I go all the way back, and we were mining back into the 70s. Everybody has their own golden era, and they wanted to make sure that you could see that in the data, find the stuff you're interested in and connect it with it. So they built out that metadata model using the tree structures and the semantic data, launched the app, and it was a real hit. First of all, it was revolutionary because the entire catalog was available for free. Second of all, it was called things like addictive, consuming, let's see, so good I used up my data plan, or let's see, I used up my data plan good. And most importantly, and this is something I kind of chimed in on because it was our project, it really is an example of smart metadata, pulling all that data together and around assets and making it available to people so that they can interact with it and find the things they love. And this is kind of what the app looks like. you can go download it, but also if you go online, it's the same kind of search. And one of the things I wanted to point out was that when you actually, it's sort of putting some meat behind the semantic data model, when you actually do a search, you don't actually search keywords against the metadata, you actually navigate through the semantic data. If you're looking for Kristen Wiig, you'll very quickly find that you have lots of options. Did you want to see the episode she acted in? Did you want to see the characters that she played? It really starts exposing that whole rich data around the show in a way that invites you to go in and find what you want. And then it also flips it around and looks at what you're doing and uses the connections between the data to actually suggest blocks of content for you to consume. It's a really big hit with almost everybody. These are not things that we wrote. These are things that people have written about it over time. And yeah, exactly. There's one in here that says, I may or may not have spent all day downloading sketches, but the app is so good that I may or may not have spent my whole day downloading sketches. And that's really where I think I want to end this kind of discussion on metadata. That when you have really, really important content, whether it is the assets that run your business, intelligence that is mission critical, or content that people know and love, it's only when you can actually get that metadata together that it can make the impact, your data can actually make the impact that it deserves. And that's kind of where we're thinking, right? We're thinking that when you look across all these different functions of metadata, all that common data, it shouldn't just be separate. It shouldn't just be in the silos of data. It actually can be modeled with NoSQL documents and semantic data and put into a single system so that it can be there for all these different lines of, all these different operations. And actually each one of them can enrich that central metadata and make that bigger picture of the metadata more and more valuable. So the title of the metadata is The Value of Metadata. I learned a lot in getting ready for it around where things are, which is that the value of metadata is still largely unrealized. People know that it's the key to finding data. They know that it's the key, that data is the key to being a modern, digitally transformed business, and yet metadata is still a very difficult issue. But when we start to take a step back and think about the real challenge, maybe there's a way to start breaking down some of the silos and getting access to it. I'm going to when we were putting this together, so at this point I'm going to see if there are questions. Or actually invite you guys to actually use the Q&A panel. There you go. There are lots and lots of questions. Okay, we'll figure that out. So Shannon, you're going to ask me questions, right? So before you do, I just wanted to share the last little thought, and then we'll get to questions. When we were putting this together, it turned out we had a lot of information about metadata. So I did put some of it together for you. So I'm not sure if these are going to be some of the questions you're going to ask, but big thing, how can I make metadata mission critical to my organization? There's great research in that emerging trends. We found people sharing things like Metadata Monday was shared by Getty about metadata stories about making the impact. And then of course there are things like we talked about. The story of SNL is something that almost everybody can relate to. And walking through why that complete picture is impactful can help. How can I get started? So we've done a lot of work on specific projects. I mentioned financial services. We've also done some work in healthcare to talk about how we can apply this approach to metadata. And then what does the project look like? We've got a white paper that really lays out the principles behind modeling data in this way and putting it into action. So before I go into the final leave me, I think we're going to take a look at some questions and then see what's going on. So Shannon, were you going to pick out some questions?
Yes, indeed. And Matt, thank you so much for this great presentation. And just to answer the most commonly asked questions, I'll be sending a follow-up email by end of day Thursday with links to the slides, links to the recording of this session. So diving right into it, could you share your views of metadata administration and management versus data administration and management?
Yeah. Did you not read that disclaimer? That was no, actually, thanks, Fabrice, for asking that question. I have been talking about metadata and data as separate. There is a line in which they are separate. There is a line where they are very, very blurred. I mentioned that example from the bank around technical asset inventory. and the distinction there between data and metadata gets very, very blurred. And I would say, and the reason I'm making that point is that it's largely dependent on the use case versus the techniques. A very interesting point that I didn't make in this whole talk is that while we've tackled metadata problems, that same pattern and that same approach, NoSQL plus semantics, is also very much applicable to data problems themselves. So we've done financial data systems where that's what the model looks like. The metadata that points to them, and the governance or the data dictionary or the rules or the provenance information around that financial model can also be modeled with it and in fact can be brought together. So we have in fact systems that have the metadata and the data managed together, and that gives you a very, very interesting view now when you're doing dynamic, when you want to dynamically do things like security based on rules of provenance or security based on governance rules. So it's a really good question. It is a gray area. I do, for our purposes, highlight metadata as a separate practice because on the business application, there's opportunities to make a lot, to do projects that are just metadata focused. On a technical application, it's actually fundamentally, when you take this approach, the same thing.
So how do I convince my managers of the importance of metadata? They're all about the data, but don't care about the metadata.
Oh, yep. So I was trying to anticipate that. I think there are two things. One of them is some of the stuff we did. So you can reference it. You can talk about it. You can say, in this study, these people are there. And I think that you need to get armed with that information. But the one thing that I've always seen work is pluck out a difficult use case, pluck out a difficult question. In fact, actually, the Dataversity survey contains some questions that metadata can answer. And think about how those questions can be applied to your business. What is it that metadata, when managed properly, would be able to add to the business that you can't do today? And even go further and actually propose that let's try this out. Let's bring together a small bunch of metadata, let's model it in the right way, and let's talk about, and let me show you that this metadata that you're not interested in is actually more important potentially than your core data. Equally, I don't know, I think in today's world when you're talking about being able to find data, being able to analyze data, being able to value data, I think there's a good argument about the importance of it. Bringing it home, though, might involve taking that step, thinking about questions that you can't answer today and that you could if you really focused on metadata and maybe plug together an example.
So without a relational model, how do you get any value out of the metadata? For example, trends over time, aggregations, et cetera. Doesn't it devolve a bunch of searchable tags?
So that is a good question as well. And the relationship in the data, the rules aren't gone in this new model. It is a data model. There are schema to it. I will also say that at MarkLogic, anticipating this question, we've done a lot of work to put in temporal features that allow you to see how the data changes over time. And those two things combined are actually very, very powerful tools that go actually beyond what you would get in a database by itself. Now, a database with its data dictionary, with its management tools on top of it, with its business glossary, and all of that wrapped together and operating very, very accurately and consistently across the business does give you a very complete picture of the data that I'm not saying is not valuable. The approach we're talking about taking can encompass all that and can probably encompass the 5 or 6 sort of outliers that might stop you from getting that complete system, that complete system realized in the relational world, or might be able to combine that data system that's perfect with the 5 or 6 that probably aren't perfect. So the answer is that you can have your cake and eat it too, and those systems we're talking about make use of, many of them make use of those temporal features to understand how the data has changed, including not just how the data values have changed, but how the data model has changed over time.
Well, Matt, I'm afraid that brings us to the top of the hour, and that's all we have time for. But thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. so exciting and fun to see what you guys are doing and how you're handling the metadata in the NoSQL world. And just a reminder again, I will be sending a follow-up email by end of day Thursday to all registrants with links to the slides, links to the recording of the session, and anything else. And thanks to all of our attendees for being so engaged in everything we do and being so involved asking great questions. I just love it. Matt, thanks again. Thanks to MarkLogic for sponsoring, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Yep, thanks everybody for your participation, questions, and we look forward to helping you. Actually, I look forward to see what you're going to do with metadata. It was great talking with you all.
Cheers.